Hello and welcome to the National Corvette Museum's 2004 Hall of Fame induction. This year there are 5 members of the Corvette community that are going to be inducted into the Corvette Hall of Fame. This weekend the National Corvette Museum is celebrating its 10th anniversary. And though it is true our success does have many fathers, we would like to introduce you to 5 people who helped guide this museum from idea to reality. They are Terry McManmon, Ray Battaglini, John Brookmyer, and the late Darrel, Bowlin, and Dan Gale. All 5 of these men have individual histories in Corvette, but it was their accomplishment as a team that brings them into the Corvette Hall of Fame. So won't you travel with us back in time as we show you how the pieces to this one and only National Corvette Museum came together. In August of 1984, Terry McManmon headed to the NCRS convention in Copper Mountain, Colorado. He went with one goal in mind, to get them to judge his 1970 Corvette. But he came back with a much bigger job. For it was during this convention that a small group, including Terry and then NCRS financial officer John Brookmyer, among others, gathered to discuss the topic of collecting Corvette technical literature and documents. From here, the seed was planted. Shortly after the Copper Mountain meeting, the NCRS began to look into the feasibility of a library and archives. The results of this study were presented in a report at the 1985 National Convention in Boston. It was receiving this report that prompted the NCRS to approach Terry and ask him if he would chair a committee to try and develop the Corvette library. Terry agreed, and in July of 1986, he approached the NCRS officers and asked for approval to form the NCRS Library and Archives Foundation. It was an article in the spring 1987 issue of the Corvette Restorers publication that caught Ray Battaglini's attention. He wrote a letter to Terry volunteering his services for this worthwhile committee. In the months that Ray and John were gathering information, Terry was developing and putting together what he called scope of committee activities. This scope brought up some pretty good questions to consider at that time. For example, what are the advantages or disadvantages of starting a library and archive? How could this be funded? What about incorporating as a not-for-profit foundation? Where's the best location to place such an institution? And though the NCRS was off to a great start, they had some help in Bowling Green, Kentucky they weren't even aware of.
It actually happened in about 1985. We were doing a required 5-year plan for the corporation, which is done every year by that time at the assembly plants. And in the 5-year plan, of course, you go through what your goals are in terms of quality and cost and people programs and so forth and so on. And there's one place in the 5-year plan that allowed you to do something outside that which the corporation normally does. And somebody brought up the idea, you know, with all the space we have here at the plant, wouldn't it be great if we could build a museum for the Corvette? Well, we have about 112 acres over there, and we were only using about 30, 40, 50 of it. And so that came forward as part of the 5-year plan. I wound up at a meeting in Detroit one day, and in the meeting that day was Bob Stemple, at that time was president of General Motors. He called me aside right in the middle of the meeting, actually the reception before the meeting, and he says, "Paul," he says, "I keep hearing about this museum that you folks in Bowling Green are talking about." He says, "Tell me about it." So I gave him a short synopsis of what we had thought we'd like to do. And he looked at me, he said, "Well," he says, "you got to understand," he says, "we can never help you fund that." He says, "If I fund that one," he says, "then I got to fund the Camaro Club, I got to fund the Buick hobby, I got to fund the Chevrolet hobby." And he says, "You know, General Motors is not in business to do museums, we're in business to build cars." So I accepted that, and I said, okay. So we come back, told the plant that, you know, we've got to figure out, if we're going to do that, we've got to figure out another way to do that. So time went on, and of course we were busy building cars, not worrying about a museum. But at some point in time, Darrel Bowlin came to me again, and he says that he had heard the NCRS was trying to develop a library archive for the records. And so I told him, I said, "Well, why don't you contact the NCRS and see what they have in mind, and maybe the two ideas come together, and maybe between us we can figure out how to put something like that together." And at one point in time, we had a meeting and invited NCRS to come down.
It was this meeting in May of 1988 that would introduce the NCRS committee to Darrel Bowlin. This was key because Darrel knew the people within Chevrolet who would listen to their ideas. At Ray's suggestion, The committee arranged to get together at the Auburn-Duesenberg Museum in November of 1988. It was here that the foundation elected their first officers. Ray Battaglini became chairman, Terry McManmon became secretary, John Brookmyer became treasurer, and though they were not present at this meeting, Darrel, Bowlin, and Dan Gale were elected to the board of directors for a foundation that in time they would both lead. Other people were also elected to the board as well to help media, fundraising, and public relations.
As the editor of Corvette Quarterly, I was approached by Dan Gale to sit in on the board of directors. This is the NCM Foundation. And, you know, it was a great honor to be asked to be on the board of directors. I had no idea what I was doing, and it was kind of a daunting task, but at the same time I thought, wow, what a great opportunity to get in on the ground floor of what I hope to be a great institution. We didn't know anything about running a museum or how to even go about, you know, a capital fundraising campaign or any of that. It was strictly, we just thought, wow, wouldn't it be neat to have a place where Corvette people could go to do research on their cars, to, you know, draw up their paperwork, to get a chance to see some rare Corvettes, and just, you know, a place for Corvette enthusiasts to hang out. This whole thing was just kind of this distant dream at the time. I mean, it's hard to imagine that, you know, 5-6 years later, we'd actually see a museum.
My original involvement started around 1989, late in 1989. There was going to the Cypress Gardens show, the NCRS Florida chapter Cypress Gardens show. There was a lot of talk about the museum and a lot of dreaming about, wouldn't it be great if we could put something together, and I certainly got caught up in it right away. I just thought it was a fantastic idea. And I remember sitting in on the board meeting, and there was discussion about, you know, trying to get things going in Bowling Green, deciding on which city, because Bowling Green was not the original choice.
More than NCRS members showed up at the 1989 Winter Nationals held in Cypress Gardens, Florida. At this meeting was a task force sent from Bowling Green, Kentucky. Though GM had decided against the 20 acres near the plant, Bowling Green community officials still felt that their city was the natural location for the forthcoming museum.
I think that it was Darrel Bowlin, actually, who was instrumental in bringing in the task force from Bowling Green that donated the land.
I pretty much turned Darrel Bowlin loose, and he wound up in a couple NCRS meets talking to the board about the museum and so forth.
The city of Bowling Green and the citizens just embraced this and took us to heart and said, we want you to build it here, and we'll do what we need to do to make it as easy as possible for you. And I do remember the state of Kentucky coming in and providing support, and between the state and the local levels, that was a very, very important part in getting that museum here.
This conversation about it being elsewhere, but, you know, really Bowling Green was really the only place they had in mind at that time, particularly after the situation come up where we get a hand on this property, as well as a plant sitting right across the street. There was no question about being in Bowling Green.
Dan Gale and Ray Battaglini pushed to open a museum annex in Bowling Green to help illustrate what was to come. Additionally, this could help raise revenue through the sales of Corvette-related items. So on November 2nd, 1990, the annex held its grand opening.
And that was one of the more smarter things I think we did, was open up a living symbol of the museum for the community. And of course, it was the original Corvette gift shop. We had 4 different Corvettes on display inside the store, and for several years that was Corvette Museum Central.
Everybody went to the plant. Well, hey, now you can go to the annex and look at what the museum is going to be like. There's some cars on display. You can talk to Dan Gale, you could talk to Darrel Bowlin or Ray Battaglini, and they could explain to you what we were trying to do. But once that museum was open, there was a tangible, something that you could touch, you could see, you could enjoy, and it said that this thing is happening, and this thing is going to happen.
On June 5th, 1992, a groundbreaking ceremony was held to celebrate a dream that had somehow become a reality. Appropriately, Zora Arcus Duntov got in the seat of a bulldozer that had been decked out to look like a Corvette.
And he's got his old helmet on, okay, his old racing helmet. And I mean, he climbs up here and he gets behind the controls of this thing, and you know, and he brushed some dirt, and then they did the ceremony with the shovel, and it was great because it was like the next step. Okay, we were moving now. We were moving dirt.
In April of 1993, the National Corvette Museum Foundation was issued a building permit for their 68,000 square foot tribute to America's true sports car.
We had our meeting at the annex, and they had just laid the pad for this building. They had just laid the concrete. And we all came over here, and we stood out in the middle of the pad. The wind's blowing, and it's cold as heck. But it was the first time that you were able to see the size, you know, and this is going there, you know, and the big, we called it the frustrum back then. I don't know what it's called now, but it was called the frustrum, I guess because we didn't know what else to call it. I remember walking into that thing for the very first time, and it was like walking into a cathedral. I mean, it was so quiet, it was so big, and spacious, and it was just majestic. But that big pad out there was like, hey, wow, you know, this is cool, man. This is where this is going to be. And you got another sense of scope of how this thing was starting to take shape. All of a sudden, this big empty shell of a building was suddenly taking form internally, and the exhibits and the displays were coming together. And right up until the 11th hour, there was a lot of activity going on.
In the few days prior to the grand opening, special events such as concerts, dinners, and press conferences were held to highlight this momentous occasion.
Well, I'll never forget that day. You know, it was a Friday. It was just a beautiful blue skies, and, you know, Corvettes lining I-65 in both directions, you know, just non-stop, gridlocked from Nashville to the south and Louisville to the north.
And after the ceremonies outside, and we opened the front doors, people started crowding into the building, and they're seeing the exhibits, and they're seeing the cars, and they're seeing, for the first time, we're watching, you know, their reactions, and it was wonderful. And those of us who had been involved, whether in a minor form or in a major capacity, we all looked at each other, and every time we'd look at each other as we were walking around, we're like proud parents, you know, we just eye contact, big smile, was like, yes. And I remember saying to Jim Schechter, who wrote the book All Corvettes Are Red, I remember saying to him, this doesn't belong to us anymore. This belongs to all these people now.
Tonight's presentation focused on what was accomplished as much as who accomplished it. As strong as each individual is when they stand alone, it is when they come together that they find their greatest strengths.
Don't forget that all of us were just originally just a bunch of car enthusiasts. All we wanted to do was to create a shrine for the Corvette.
The combination of individuals and perspectives held it all together. I think we're very blessed that we had that.
So now as we induct these 5 men into the Corvette Hall of Fame, we ask you to remember each of them in their own individual way. Maybe shake the hands of the ones who could be with us, and offer a moment of silence for those who could not.